Chapter 14, the diversity of plants. There is a lot of detail in this chapter. Try not to get lost in it, but instead look at the big picture and focus on the major divisions. We're going to first discuss the plant kingdom as a whole, and then focus on seedless plants that are non-vascular and vascular. Then we'll take a look at seed plants that are gymnosperms and seed plants that are angiosperms. Plants dominate the landscape, and they play an integral role in human societies and essentially life on our planet as a whole. They developed before animals did and show greater diversity. There are about 300,000 species of cataloged plants, and the vast majority of those produce seeds. We can study the basics like mosses, ferns, conifers, and flowering plants, but it turns out there's actually a lot more diversity and kind of some really interesting defining characteristics that don't always pop up in basic study. Plants, of course, are photosynthetic organisms. There are a few that have lost their ability to photosynthesize because they're parasites, but they used to be able to. They have cell walls that contain cellulose with some notable exceptions, and they tend to reproduce sexually. They have diverse methods of asexual reproduction too. They also have indeterminate growth. That means that there's no point necessarily where a plant is done growing. If they're alive, they'll probably continue to do so. Plants had to have some major adaptations to make their way from living underwater to living on land. Here you can see a few major differences. On the left-hand side, you see an algae. For the whole algae, the entire thing performs photosynthesis. The whole thing can absorb water and CO2, and minerals can enter directly from the surrounding liquid. There's also water surrounding the plant that's supporting it. It doesn't need to have a firm body of any kind or any firm cell walls because it's supported by water. There's no reason for it to burrow itself into the ground of the ocean, so instead of having any sort of anchor root-like structure, they simply have holdfasts that hold them to whatever surface they would like to stay attached to. They don't have any purposes other than that. On land plants, however, we have specialized leaves to perform photosynthesis in certain areas of the plants. There are cuticles to reduce water loss. It's no longer surrounded by water, so it needs to be concerned with quantities. Stomata allow for specific gas exchange. Stems support the plant against Earth's gravity, and roots anchor the plant and help it to absorb water and minerals from the soil below it. A neat thing when we study the different types of plants are studying the ways that they reproduce, and this is referred to as the alternation of generations. Plants can be haplonic, which means they have a dominant haploid stage, so the largest, most ecologically important part of the plant's life cycle is when it's a haploid or 1N, or it can be diplonic, which means that the largest and most important ecological stage is when it's a diploid. However, most plants are haplodiplonic, which is a nice mouthful, and that means that they spend time as a sporophyte and as a gametophyte. The sporophyte version of the plant is multicellular and diploid, and it makes spores by meiosis. The gametophyte, however, is the haploid multicellular form, and it makes gametes by mitosis. Here's what that picture looks like, or here's what that life cycle looks like. You have gametes that come from two different gametophytes. They fuse into a zygote, grow via mitosis, and become a sporophyte multicellular plant where the vast majority of the nuclei are 2N. Via meiosis, they can form spores that are genetically unique. Those spores can grow via mitosis into a fully formed gametophyte. The gametophyte is a multicellular organism in which the vast majority of nuclei are 1N. It can make gametes via mitosis. Two gametes come together to form the zygote that becomes the sporophyte, so on and so forth. Let's study some of the different structures in plants. Specifically in seedless plants, they have something called sporangia. Seedless plants undergo the process of syngamy, which is when the two different gametes come together to make the sporophyte. The sporophyte version of the plant has sporangia, and that's just the special name for the reproductive sac on the plant that contains all of the spores. Diploid sporophytes, or mother cells, produce haploid spores via the process of meiosis, just like we learned in a previous chapter. Some plants have different types of spores. If a plant only creates one type of spore, and by type I mean sex, technically, one sex of spore, we call them homosporous. There are certain plants that are heterosporous and they produce two morphologically different types of spores, and you could think of them like male and female spores. Most seedless vascular plants and all seed plants are heterosporous. You only find this homosporous version in the non-vascular seedless plants. When haploid spores germinate, they create a multicellular gametophyte by mitosis. The gametophyte supports the zygote formed when those two different gametes fuse, and the resulting young sporophyte grows and the cycle starts all over again. That's essentially a text version of the picture you saw on the next slide, on the last slide. Here it is again. This specifically is the life cycle of a fern, and it shows you those steps all over, just with specific materials from a plant. Your book gives you yet another specific example of alternation of generations when we look at the life cycle of a moss. The difference here is that the gametophyte and the sporophyte often live off of the same large structure. So let's talk a little bit more about those sporangia and seedless plants. Spores and pollen are often surrounded by very thick cell walls. They have a really strong polymer called sporopollenin. These are just really long chains of fatty acids and carotenoids. These sporopollen polymers are really important because they are remarkably resistant to chemical and biological degradation, essentially, which means that a spore that has been fertilized can sit in the ground for thousands of years, and you can bring it back to life. It will grow into a brand new plant. Protection of the embryo is a major requirement for land plants. The female gametophyte provides a lot of the nutrition, and then the embryo is protected as it develops in the new sporophyte, and if it's waiting to develop, it has this nice seed coat. Let's look at the gametangia in seedless plants. So the gametangia are the structures on gametophytes rather than on sporophytes. They have gametes being produced within them thanks to the process of mitosis. There's a male and female version. The antheridium is the male version, and it can release sperm. In a lot of these seedless non-vascular plants, the sperm actually have little flagella on them, and they can swim to the female gametangia, which is called an archegonia. So a lot of the time, all of this happens on the same plant or on a neighboring plant. Nothing ever travels very far. Some other important physical features are the apical meristems that are growing in all of these plants. These are the regions of rapid division that are allowing the shoots and plants to increase in length throughout the lifespan. Plants do not have a kind of a growth mark. They don't have a benchmark. There's no point in time when they're technically done growing. They'll continue to grow as long as the environment allows it. There are different parts of plants that grow in different ways. If you're looking at a sunflower stem that's getting thicker or a tree trunk that's getting thicker, you're talking about the lateral meristem. And again, it'll just continue to get bigger until we have some sort of reason, something to stop the plant from getting bigger. The ability for vascular plants to grow in all different directions is really essential to their survival. They need to grow up to get as much sun as possible, and they need to grow down to have the best possible access to water and the different essential minerals. The recap for this little section is just to remind you that plants have evolved a lot since they've come on land. Really early land plants had to grow really close to the ground and in moist places in order to avoid issues with water loss. But then plants developed a waxy cuticle to prevent that. Then they developed these really strong cell walls that let them get taller, and now we see plants that are developing physical and chemical defenses in order to avoid being eaten by other animals. They have spikes, or they contain noxious chemicals or poisons, so plants are continuing to evolve even if maybe we don't see it. When we split up plants, we split them into non-vascular plants and vascular plants. Non-vascular plants are seedless, as are some of the vascular plants. And this is kind of the order in which we're going to study them, going from left to right. Let's start with the bryophytes. There are about 18,000 species of bryophytes. They thrive in really damp, really moist habitats, although some of them are capable of growing in the desert. They don't have any vascular materials, so they don't have specialized tubes that are made to carry water or nutrients. They just have individual cells that help them to do that, and that's why we call them non-vascular plants. The largest part of a bryophyte, the part that you're most likely to notice if you're studying their ecology, is their gametophyte or their haploid form. The diploid form tends to be just a little tiny cluster of cells that might divide just a few times before splitting off to become two haploid organisms, or 3 or 4 depending on how many cells you have. The neat thing about those diploid forms is that they do commonly have gametes that use little flagella to swim to the nearest plant. Sporangium, the multicellular sexual reproductive structures, are present in bryophytes, so they do have some advanced body forms. Kind of a crazy thing about bryophytes tends to be that their embryo remains attached to the parent plant, which nourishes it. You saw that in this slide where you have part of the young gametophyte growing on the other part of the plant, so that was down in the mosses. The bryophytes are divided into 3 divisions: the liverworts, the hornworts, and the mosses. Liverworts are the most closely related ancestor to the original plants that moved on land. There are about 6,000 species of them. They're very interesting. The gametophyte form has these big, lobular green structures that look just like a liver, and that's actually where they got their names from. Hornworts are also named for their kind of defining physical feature. You can see these little horns that are sticking up in this plant. That's the sporophyte version. The spores of this plant are the brown tips. All of the green vegetation, that blue-green vegetation on the bottom, that's the gametophyte. That's the large structure of this plant. Hornworts, just like liverworts, have colonized, a pretty diverse habitat group on land, but they need to stay near moisture, especially for reproduction. The final bryophyte we'll discuss are the mosses. There are more than 12,000 mosses. You can find them anywhere from the tundra to the forest floor. A kind of a neat thing about mosses is that they have a rhizoid structure similar to roots, but they're not responsible for pulling in water and nutrients. They are actually responsible for just kind of fastening them to whatever it is that they're growing on. This is great for erosion in that area, actually, because by fastening themselves to the soil can't get washed away in, something is running over top of it, or if there's a rainstorm or something that would normally disrupt that environment. They're also very sensitive to air pollution, and we can use them to monitor the quality of air, which is kind of interesting. Let's take a look at vascular plants now that we've gone through non-vascular plants. Some have seeds and some do not. These are the most dominant group of land plants, about 275,000 species. I think 260,000 species is also commonly thrown out there too, but vascular plants account for about 90% of our planet's vegetation. When plants are vascular, that means they have xylem and phloem. Xylem are specialized tubes of cells for the transportation of water and minerals from the roots to the entire plant. And then phloem cells transport sugar, proteins, and solutes throughout the rest of the plant. Vascular plants also have true roots, which support them and transport water and minerals. And then finally, they have leaves, which can be specialized into sporophylls or strobili. Leaves capture more sunlight thanks to their nice increased surface area, and they can be changed to structurally bare sporangia. We're going to talk about the sporophylls and the strobili when we get to angiosperms. Club mosses are some of the seedless vascular plants. These are the earliest group. They dominated the Carboniferous period in our history. These little guys actually grew into really tall trees and formed really big swamps. Now, when we dig carbon out of the ground, when we dig coal out of the ground, it's these plants that they're burning. Today, they have evolved to these really small evergreen plants that just have a little tiny stem and itty bitty little leaves called microphylls. There's only about 1,000 species of club mosses. There are quillworts, club mosses, and spike mosses that fall into this category. Horsetails are also seedless vascular plants. There's just a single species of them. They used to kind of dominate the world too back in that Carboniferous period. Nowadays, we find them in damp environments and mosses. The stems of horsetails have these really neat, like little nodes. It looks like branches, like you see on a normal tree, but they don't have that much specialization. If you were to actually like cut the plant and put it under a microscope, they just kind of node off. The leaves and branches too do come out in whorls from evenly spaced rings. And when we say whorls, it sounds a little funny, but if you think about a wheel, how you have the spokes come out from the center of a wheel at like really obvious integrals, that's what you're talking about in whorls. It's just every so often, every 2 millimeters, you have another spoke on your bike wheel. Go 2 millimeters, another spoke, 2 millimeters, another spoke. Leaves and branches come out in very predicted whorls like that too. The needle-shaped leaves in horsetails don't actually go through photosynthesis, or not a lot of photosynthesis. The vast majority of that takes place on their really thick green stems. So they look kind of similar to our Palo Verde trees. Let's talk about ferns and whisk ferns. Ferns are the most advanced seedless vascular plants. Ferns have really large leaves, branching roots, and about 12,000 species. They tend to prefer moist shade, but they can tolerate surprisingly a lot of variability in their environment. Whisk ferns lack both true roots and leaves, and they undergo photosynthesis on their green stems, which is kind of strange. And they have these little tiny yellow knobs on the tips of each of the little branches that contain the reproductive material. So you might be asking, if these two things are so dissimilar, why are we talking about them together? And that's actually kind of a neat point. It looks like ferns and whisk ferns are very closely related. Whisk ferns actually evolved and lost their roots and leaves. They do great undergoing photosynthesis. On their stems, they found a niche where that really works for them and kind of ran with it. So they look different. They look very kind of not compatible, but they actually are. Let's move on to, with the evolution of seed plants, what we started seeing was a really dominant sporophyte generation. So the largest part of this plant, the most ecologically important part of this plant, is the diploid part, which of course meant that the gametophyte became smaller and smaller, often just to become a microscopic cluster of cells. All seed plants are heterosporous. They have female spores and male spores. Seeds and pollen turned out to be really two fantastic evolutionary advantages because they allow for air or bugs or basically anything but water to move themselves around, so they're not dependent on water for reproduction, and they also offer really great protection for embryos. And they can nourish that embryo for years, which can allow the seeds to remain dormant for extended periods of time. When we talk about seed plants, we split them up into gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms, it means naked seeds. Gymnosperms have separate female and male gametes. They are pollinated by the wind, and they have specialized vascular cells. In their microsporophytes, they make microspores, and those develop slowly into pollen grains. Each of them contains 2 cells. One of them actually becomes 2 different sperm, and then one of them becomes a pollen tube cell. You have to have the pollen tube cell to grow into the ovule of the female plant. The act of fertilization takes a little bit of work when it comes to plants. The female cones also contain 2 cells, 2 ovules per scale. One of their megasporites undergoes meiosis in each ovule. So you have just one haploid cell that actually develops into the gametophyte, and the other haploid cell will feed the embryo itself, because the embryo is enclosed in this really tough coat, and it can take a really long time for that seed to essentially be ready to grow into a whole plant. The main type of gymnosperm is a conifer. It's the dominant phylum with the most variety of species. Most conifers are really tall trees that have either scale-like or needle-like leaves. They have really waxy cuticles that limit water loss, and snow just slides right off of them. This makes them excellent at growing in really cold, really dry regions. Really popular conifers would be like evergreen trees, oak pines, spruces, and firs. There are a couple of examples that lose their leaves every fall. When it comes to conifers, kind of their biggest issue is actually that we like to cut them down to harvest them for paper pulp and for timber. Other gymnosperms are the cycads. These thrive in really mild climates. They're often mistaken for palms because of the shape of their leaves. You can see in the picture they kind of look like the Mexican fan palm. The leaf just isn't as long. They have really large cones that can be pollinated by beetles rather than by wind, which does make them different. There's about 100 species of these, but they're facing possible extinction even though they've been around since the time of the dinosaurs. And that's because we tend to use them as ornamental plants in gardens, and you don't necessarily have enough of them for them to reproduce with one another, or just a whole variety of issues have come up. To stop their reproduction. The third group of gymnosperms are the ginkgophytes. The only surviving species of this group is ginkgobiloba. They're really easily recognizable for their fan-shaped leaves, which is really unique among seed plants because they have a really specific vein pattern if you ever look at the back of them. They're really pretty in autumn, and they fall to the ground, which again is a little different for the gymnosperms. A lot of ginkgo biloba plants exist anywhere where Buddhist monks exist. They made tea out of them and helped to ensure their preservation. You find them a lot in cities that are trying to kind of revamp the city and bring back plant life because they're really resistant to pollution. However, you have to be careful when you grow them because there are male trees and female trees, and the female trees tend to smell, the book says like rancid butter, but I've been around a female ginkgo biloba tree and personally I think it smelled like puke. So you have to consider what you're doing when you are growing them. The final group of gymnosperms are the netophytes. These are the closest living relative to modern angiosperms or flowering plants. They've got really broad leaves and really developed vessel elements in their xylem, so they're very strong plants. They do a great job growing as vines in tropical and subtropical zones. You can find them in a few different deserts though, and they're very hardy. They can live up to 2,000 years. Ephedra, if you've ever heard of ephedra, or some of the really potent decongestants that are floating around out there with the dangerous medications that are popular in the southwestern United States, come from netophyte plants that can be found out in the desert. We're going to switch gears and talk about the last section of the book, which is the angiosperms. Angiosperms are flowering plants, and they are really successful due to those flowers and those fruits. Flowers have allowed plants to cooperate and essentially build relationships with insects and animals, and that's kind of driven their evolution. And then they have fruits, which is excellent protection for their embryo and acts as yet another way to disperse or move their seeds around their environment. When we look at the structure of a flowering plant, what you see here is considered a perfect flower because it has both male and female parts. On the left-hand side, they focus on the female parts. The carpel, you have that large kind of vase-like shape. The top of the vase, or the opening to the carpel, is the stigma. There's the long stalk-like style, and then finally the ovary that protects the ovules where those little megasporangia are undergoing meiosis in order to create egg cells. The male part of the plant is the androcenum, or the stamen. The top portion of it is the anther, where your microsporangia are turning into pieces of pollen, and they're held kind of up into the air away from the base of the flower by a filament. When we look at the reproductive processes in flowers, we find that they can actually self-pollinate if they have both male and female parts. Some flowers are imperfect, so they're either only male or only female. Let's focus on the male part of this procedure first, with the microsporangium that are dividing in the anther. They grow from a mother cell via meiosis to form haploid cells, which then grow via mitosis to get bigger to make little pieces of pollen. Within every piece of pollen, you actually have the generative cell, so the sperm itself, and then the tube cell. There are 2 sperm in each generative cell, and when the pollen reaches the top of the stamen, that little pollen tube cell will grow down through the stigma, through the style, down into the ovary, and the pollen tube will actually deposit the 2 sperm into the little embryo sac. One of those sperm and one of the little diploid nuclei that exist in the ovary itself will become triploid. So just like there were 2 cells in the individual pieces of pollen, there are 2 little waiting cells inside of the little individual ovules. But the cool thing about the female side is you have 1 cell, 1 egg cell that is haploid and 1 egg cell that is diploid. So one of your sperm is going to fertilize that diploid cell to become triploid or triploid. It is going to grow into the food source for the future embryo, and we'll see that in just a second. And then the other sperm is going to fertilize that 1 end cell to make a 2 end cell that will eventually grow. So here's what we're talking about. So we have this spore sac that's got 2 nuclei in it, and it's got 2 eggs in it. 1 egg is 2N, 1 egg is 1N, and what you end up with is a sperm that's going to help create the embryo, the little 2N piece, and one of the sperm is going to create a 3N cell, a 3N endosperm. And that is essentially going to become a food source. So this pollinated, fertilized embryo does not have to grow right this minute. It actually has quite a bit of time for it to grow and develop before it needs to be planted or buried in the ground somehow, so it can develop into a new flower. When we look at the diversity of angiosperms, they have a single division. They're all members of the Anthrophyta. They're a monophyletic group, which means all flowering plants have a single common ancestor. We can study them as monocots and dicots. We study them split on the structure of the cotyledons, so the very first teeny tiny little leaves that they have when they're still inside of the seeds, what their pollen grains look like, and just a few other general characteristics. When we talk about monocots, we're usually talking about grasses and lilies. When we talk about dicots, we're talking about essentially everything else. There are just a few plants that exhibit characteristics from both the monocot and dicot group, and we refer to those as the basal angiosperms. We're pretty sure that they evolved before the split from monocots and dicots because they're so different. We look at examples like magnolia trees when we discuss basal angiosperms, laurel trees, lilies, lotus flowers, and then even some berries that create things like black pepper, part of these basal angiosperm plants. For your monocots, so monocots are called monocot because they have a mono, 1 cotyledon, 1 little tiny leaf inside of their seedling. They also have veins that run parallel to the length of their leaves, and all of their flowering parts are arranged in groups of 3 or groups of 6. The pollen from these angiosperms are also monoscellate, and that means they have 1 little pore in them where that pollen tube will grow out of. True woody tissue is very rarely found in monocots, so when vascular bundles are arranged in a very specific organization that gives them essentially a lot of structural tension, they can make woody tissues eventually. You don't see that in monocots. Monocots also have root systems that are just going to grow where it's best for them. They don't have a single deep taproot that grows straight down. Monocots include true lilies, orchids, grasses, palms, corn, sugarcane, bananas, pineapples, basically all your tropical fruits are monocots. Dicots, on the other hand, or eudicots, have two cotyledons, so two little tiny seedlings inside of that little embryo, or two tiny little leaves inside of that little embryo. Their veins form branching networks. Flower parts are grouped in 4, 5, or multiple whorls. They have vascular tissues that form very structured supportive rings in their cells. And that means that they can be herbaceous, or they have a really strong woody tissue, so hardwood that comes from dicots. They tend to produce pollens with multiple pores in them. Their root systems tend to be anchored, very well planned and structured. About 2/3 of all flowering plants are monocots, are dicots. The issue with trying to lump plants as true dicots or monocots, however, is that there does tend to be a lot of crossover between these two groups. So we're not going to focus so much worrying about the characteristics, but rather learning kind of who is a model example of each group is probably your best bet when you're studying these plants. With that, we end this very long and detailed chapter. You should read it, take some great notes, find external resources, and I'm going to suggest that you create an outline because this is a lot of information. Good luck and have fun with it.